Alright, so I'm working on some big projects for you guys at the moment, so in the meantime, here's a video that I've been meaning to get around to for a while but never did. I used to be hard set against the concept of video game remakes, but I feel I've come around to the idea. There's definitely a conversation to be had about what games deserve to be remade, but my opinion on the matter is who the bloody hell cares, because nobody gets to decide what things do or don't deserve to be remade, because I believe restricting artistic vision is reductive and the only reason that anything should need to exist is whether or not someone wanted to make it. With that said, there's a tendency of highly publicized remakes only being for games that have a ton of clout, which usually means that most remakes you see are for games that were already good. Dead Space, The Last of Us, and Resident Evil 4 were 3 remakes that came out in a relatively short span of time. All of these games were already good. Yes, The Last of Us is good, shut up. And all of them were really well known. So you could argue that the reason for them getting remakes in the first place was about money first and anything artistic second. But for me, the more interesting use of remakes is to give a second chance to games that maybe had a spark of originality and had potential to be great, but for whatever reason or another never quite made it. So I thought it would be a fun idea to give my personal top 20 weird and obscure games that badly need to be remade. The only condition I have for this list is that I have to have personally played it. There are some obvious entries here like God Hand or Second Sight, but whatever you think of those games, I've never actually played them, so me ranking them on the list like this would be utterly meaningless. Otherwise than that, let's get on with the show. So I'm not gonna lie to you guys, The Sentinel is a game that probably 4 or 5 of you might have heard of, but it's one of those games that I played on a whim not knowing anything about it, and not even being able to understand what it was about at a first glance. But it's one of those games that I find myself weirdly addicted to. It's a first-person puzzle game where you can only move around by warping to specific warp points that you create yourself, but you can only create warp points at the same elevation as you or lower, or on top of these special blocks. You can absorb the energy of objects around you to create these objects, and you can only absorb objects that are at a lower elevation than you. Eventually, you have to build yourself up so that you're high enough to absorb the Sentinel, who sits at the highest point of the level overlooking the rest of it. That is, before it absorbs you. It's a very simple but very addicting first-person puzzle game unlike any other game I've ever played that I quite enjoy. Sentinel Returns in particular also has a diseased aesthetic that I can dig like a shallow grave. It wouldn't necessarily be great as a major AAA release, but looking at this game, it's practically tailor-made for VR. Warping from point to point, using those motion controllers to point at things and absorb them, I would love to see this franchise be revived for VR. It would be perfect. So get on that, whoever the hell owns this IP. I think it's Sony, as Sentinel Returns was published by one of their subsidiaries, but I have no idea. Not every game on this list is both weird and obscure, but as far as filling out that criteria, Phantasmagoria 2 certainly checks both boxes. An FMV game from the 90s, and as such, it's good in some ways, but really bad in some other ways. On one hand, it's a movie that's a paragon of cheesy camp and compelling awkwardness, with a level of conviction and heart that makes it one of the better told, acted, and presented FMV games from a storytelling perspective. It was ahead of its time in many ways, and in some ways it's still ahead of its time. On its face, it's about a corrupt pharmaceutical company with an undercurrent of sci-fi weirdness, multi-dimensional beings, and a main character's psyche being gradually broken down by forces beyond his understanding. But it's also about identity, about discovering oneself, about struggling with mental health, and even sexuality. It even has a positive depiction of a gay character, which was groundbreaking in the 90s. Matter of fact, this whole game has a very sex-positive attitude, which is something we can use more of these days, given how prudish our society can be. Unfortunately, because it was a movie first and a game second, and that game was a not particularly good point-and-click adventure game, as a game, Phantasmagoria 2 sucks a fat one. Plus, as good as the story was, it was held back by its budget quite a bit. I'm not sure how a remake would work, given that the actors have largely aged out of their roles, but I would like to see this game get a second chance, especially now in the era where FMV games have started to make a comeback. Thrill Kill, how I love and am ambivalent towards you. The reason why I think this IP should be brought back is because I would love to see what they could do with Thrill Kill in a modern day setting. This was of course a game that was allegedly so vile that it was effectively banned back in the late 90s for its extreme violence and grotesque imagery, but much more brutal and violent games have come out since then, and I would like to see what they could pull off these days. I think a four-corner brawler is a neat idea that isn't nearly done enough. Matter of fact, I can't think of many examples of this kind of concept. I would love to see it, but unfortunately it's probably never gonna happen because this IP is owned by EA, and EA is the worst. MACE: The Dark Age is an obscure one-on-one fighter from the 90s, released in arcades and later ported to the N64. Let me just tell you, thematically this might be one of my favorite games of all time. This is a game with pure metal energy through to the bone marrow. You got these brutal characters, intense imagery, and one of the greatest pre-fight screens I've ever seen. The lore is great, the characters are great, but the actual game sucks a fat one. The controls are extremely stiff and extremely sticky. It's one of those games where it feels like you're fighting in molasses for how awful the controls are. It's a shame because I love literally everything about this game except the gameplay, so if they gave it another chance, made it into a more smooth and intuitive game, maybe added a proper story mode, then flesh out the world and lore, this could genuinely be a fantastic one-on-one fighter. Unfortunately, the MACE: The Dark Age IP is owned by Atari, I believe, and I don't even know what the hell is going on with Atari. They appear to just be a corpse that keeps on twitching. They haven't been relevant to the gaming industry since the 80s, and yet they keep puttering along in various forms. I'm not even sure if they're really making games anymore. If you watched my series of Twisted Metal knockoffs, you'll be well aware of the BATTLETANX games. Big N64 games for their time that were made by the 3DO company but have since faded into the ether. A shame because the tank fighting genre isn't too well represented, and BATTLETANX was a relatively fun, if flawed series, with a stimulating gameplay loop and a story that is so melodramatic and over the top that you can't help but feel compelled by it, at least until it drank 2 liters of bat shit in the second game. I think a remake could serve to fix the controls and repetition, as well as the less than stellar optimization. Plus, with modern technology, you can really turn the things that BATTLETANX was doing up to 11, like the real-time environmental destruction. The scale that they could reach with this series in a modern-day setting could be, in no uncertain terms, friggin' sweet. I think the IP is owned by something called Prism Entertainment, but they don't seem to be interested in making anything of it. But maybe they could sell the IP to Ziggurat like they did to some of their other IP, but only time will tell. And hey, maybe this could give them the chance to finish off their horribly unfinished story. 3D beat-em-ups aren't the most common genre, especially these days now that 2D beat-em-ups have passed the 20-year threshold of being nostalgic. So you theoretically don't need to keep up with modern trends in order for people to want to buy them. There are games like Yakuza, which are definitely 3D beat-em-ups, but they also have the open world elements because the beat-em-up concept is simple enough that most big releases need more than that to justify themselves. Tai-Fu Wrath of the Tiger was a late 90s 3D beat-em-up. It's also a game that I'm convinced that I'm the only person who's ever played it. But it's a really good time, with quality audio-visual feedback in combat and clever utilization of chi attacks. The visuals were nice with several distinct regions to play through, and it was somewhat ahead of its time presentation-wise with great voice acting and an attempt at more involved storytelling. John DiMaggio plays Tai in one of his earliest professional roles, and he's just as good as ever. It's also worth mentioning who developed this game. DreamWorks Interactive, who would later on go on to become Danger Close Games, who are famous for making the Medal of Honor games. But this is a game that's connected to DreamWorks, who also stars an anthropomorphic tiger. Wonder if this eventually inspired anything. This is a solid game that seemingly nobody's played, so I'd like to see it get a second chance. So long as they can make it look decent and make the combat stimulating, it could be a great game in the modern era. Activision published this game, so they probably own the franchise, so who knows if they'd be willing to give it another go, but I'd like to see it. Before Insomniac Games were famous, they were a small up-and-coming developer with tons of potential and everything to prove, and it was out of that particular era of their existence that they brought out Disruptor. Great game, meaningless title. The story was a cheesy FMV affair with zero production value. This world-changing event took place within like 5 or 6 rooms and starred like 6 people. But it had sort of a scrappy charm to it that I quite like, and the actual game is a fast, frantic, very fun first-person shooter during a time when every shooter was attempting to be Doom, although the controls suffered because pre-analog stick console first-person shooters all suffered from the same issue of being unable to independently move and aim. Something that's so standard as to be mundane in modern FPSs. Still, it received critical acclaim, even being praised by John Romero, but unfortunately it bombed sales-wise. Insomniac Games have since gone on to become one of the crown jewels of PlayStation, and they're fairly versatile in the games that they've made. So I'd like to see them take another stab at this, and in this age of the boomer shooter revival, I think there's no better time for them to bring back this little piece of their history. There is, however, one problem. They made this game under Universal Interactive, so they likely owned the IP. Universal Interactive was later folded into Activision Blizzard, so it probably would be a bit of a challenge to get the property back, but if not, I'd like to at least see them take another stab at the concept, a spiritual successor, if you will. Now, this one's probably going to be a tough sell given the fact that, relatively speaking, it's still fairly new, but personally, I would like to see Devil's Third get a second chance because I kind of love it despite the fact that it's a completely and utterly awful game. It's essentially budget Metal Gear Solid that attempts to do melee combat and ranged combat at the same time and utterly fails at both, with a plot line that's one of the most atrociously hilarious things I've ever seen about a worldwide blackout causing a total systemic collapse, with the only person who can stop it being Captain Russia McVodka. Despite itself, it's an absolute joy to play in the same way that you'd watch a bad movie ironically, but unfortunately, it was a Wii U exclusive during the dying days of that platform, and it was such a predestined failure that very few physical copies were ever made, and now with the Wii U eShop being shut down, Wii U's themselves being kinda rare, and also Wii U's allegedly bricking themselves if you go long enough without using them, our means to play this game officially will become harder and harder as time goes on, and I feel like the concept, for as absolutely hilariously badly executed as it was, does have potential to work in a campy B-movie sort of way, so long as they can get the gameplay working halfway decently. I feel like if they were to remake it, make the gameplay not so terrible, and release it on consoles that people actually own, this could potentially get the trilogy that they envisioned, because there's a certain scrappy charm to this game that you don't often get with modern AAA games.
I am getting down with you! Oh.
Metal Arm's glitch in the system from a pure gameplay standpoint is like Ratchet & Clank but better, and trust me, if you're mad at me saying that, it only proves that you've never played Metal Arm's glitch in the system. It's the only game made by Swing and Ape Studios before the studio was then bought out and mismanaged into bankruptcy by Activision Blizzard. Yep, we're back to Activision again. It's a game built around a selection of impactful upgradable weapons, a series of puzzles that include such gameplay mechanics as possessing other robots, and it has a unique element in that as you damage the various robots, they'll gradually fall apart, thereby losing functionality, until they're on the verge of blowing up and are essentially just spastic piles of machine parts with no control over their functions. There was a lot of detail to the gameplay, and the game overall had a very fun sense of humor about itself. Agent Shush, codename Shush, lives rent-free in my head.
Shut your VM28/9 sound hole and listen up. I'm Agent Shush, codename Shush.
It also had a who's who of well-known voice actors such as Patrick Warburton, Dan Castellaneta, and Darren Norris. Unfortunately, it suffered from a flawed story that felt like it was very aimless and served to set up a lot of things for a sequel that never came to be. So I would love to see Metal Arm's glitch in the system be brought back. It's already fantastic in its own right, so I would love to see what they could do with this game with more contemporary tech. As a matter of fact, I know that some of the creators were trying to get a hold of the license at one point, but Activision shut them down. But come on, Activision, you're not doing anything with it. Just let the men have their day. This is a potential franchise that's too good to sit on. Fighting Force is a game by Core Design made right at the height of Tomb Raider's popularity. It was their less popular franchise in the late 90s, and despite not being the greatest game, I find myself coming back to this one every now and again. A beat-em-up game built around the slightly quaint idea of a scientist wanting to kickstart the end of the world after the world fails to end after Y2K. The 2D side-scrolling beat-em-up concept wasn't translated to 3D particularly well. Hit connection isn't great, neither is the attack range, and the sound design is weak. But with 4 playable characters and multiple paths, this is a game that's surprisingly replayable, though it is kinda rough in every other way, so I would like to see them give it another shot, take the initial concept and make it better. Give me replayable short playthroughs, but with 3D beat-em-up gameplay worth a damn. I'd assume that this is one of the properties that ended up with Square Enix after Eidos was bought out, and I'm not sure how keen they are to bring it back, or how keen they are on the whole thing generally these days, but at least this is something that has a possibility of happening. You know, what with how many revivals Tomb Raider's gotten. And hey, if they do remake Fighting Force, maybe they can make a Fighting Force 2 that doesn't suck its own farts. So I think everyone agrees that isometric shooters are a bit overdone, right? So why am I saying they should remake an isometric shooter? Well, because Loaded is one of the earliest examples of the genre, and quite frankly, it's charming as hell for as crude as it is. It's a bloody and violent shooter where you play as one of several dastardly criminals as they escape from their prison planet and attempt to take revenge on the person who got them locked up. It's a game that's defined by its mid-90s presentation. On a side note, I was alive during the 90s, but by no means living. I wasn't really self-aware until the early 2000s, and that was when I remember thinking, man, life is so boring these days. Nothing about the 90s up until now really stands out. But if you look back at the 80s and 70s and 60s, there's so much that defines those decades. The 60s was all about hippies, the 70s was all about disco, the 80s was all about big hair, neon, and Saturday morning cartoons, but the 90s was so plain. But now the 90s is associated with edginess, nu metal, grunge, and jorts. It's funny how these things don't become apparent until decades later, and on a side note, man, I was an edgy contrarian even back then, automatically assuming that things were way cooler before I was born. You know what they say, the other man's ass is always cleaner. Oh yeah, Loaded. Isometric shooters are a dime a dozen these days, but given that this is one of the granddaddies of isometric shooters, I would love to see it make a comeback. And hey, it might even give Interplay something to do, considering they've continued to exist without releasing any new products for so long. I'm not entirely convinced the company isn't a front for something at this point. You know, I genuinely like obscure horror games because generally speaking, the more interesting experiences are going to be the ones you haven't heard of, because if something is mainstream, it usually means that it appeals to a wide audience. But sometimes, if you haven't heard of something, it might mean that it's just not very well made. Case in point, Juggernaut on PS1, published by Jellico in North America, a notable video game developer and publisher through the 80s and 90s that has since vanished off the face of the earth. It's an interesting concept. Your girlfriend Sarah has been possessed by Satan, so you need to shed your mortal skin and go inside her mind to exorcise her soul. Something like this has potential for some really messed up, nightmarish, and surreal imagery, and you do get a hint of that, but the problem is, this game is a double whammy of way too long and really, really dull. It came on 3 discs, and it really should have been cut down to 1. The essence of horror is surprise, and so a horror game is better served as a short experience that ends as soon as it runs out of new ideas to psych you out. This is especially apparent when you consider that there really isn't any actual gameplay here. This is a Myst-style point-and-click adventure puzzler, so there's nothing about this game that you can rely on once the imagery stops being effective. But I think that this entire premise has a lot of potential. The idea of being this non-corporeal force in this theoretical environment made out of the psyche of your own girlfriend, fighting nightmarish creatures, possessing various forms in order to solve puzzles. There's a lot here. Unfortunately, the game was horribly mishandled, so I would very much like to see a second try at this. Especially when you consider how unique this is as a concept. Granted, I haven't played every horror game out there, so I'm sure there are a few games like it, but that doesn't change my opinion. Now, I'm not sure who owns the property. It was made by something called Tonkin House, who also published it in Japan, which was apparently a subsidiary of a company called Tokyo Shoseki. which is a textbook publishing company. I doubt they have any interest in the property, seeing as their video game division closed down in 2008. So maybe this one would have a chance if a developer or publisher was interested enough to buy the property. I know some people are probably going to take exception to me calling Interstate 76 an obscure game, but what can I say? None of my friends have ever heard of it, and honestly, before I covered it for one of my videos, I'd never heard of it. People are evidently much more familiar with the spin-off Vigilante 8, though that's probably because it came out on consoles. Which is a shame, because Interstate 76 is a really solid game with a lot going for it. It's a car combat game with a lot of intricacies you don't generally get in car combat games. Customization elements, an organic control system for the cars. It's a pretty complex game given the genre. Add to that the fact that it has a fun sense of humor and a funky aesthetic, and it's a really good time. Unfortunately, this game suffers from two issues. First of all, the graphics are so primitive that it's kind of hard to go back to if you don't already have nostalgia for Interstate 76, but more importantly, it's a game that essentially is broken on modern systems. If you play it at 60 FPS, the game will be impossible to beat, and my attempts to play it at 30 FPS or less resulted in instability issues. The fact is, this is a game that has the potential to appeal to a mainstream audience and tap into that disco theming, which is somewhat rare these days, and given the fact that the ways to play this game on a modern system are unstable at best, I'd say it would be a great game to bring up to date with modern graphics, controls, and presentation. Vigilante 8 already got a remake back during the Xbox 360 days, so why not remake the game that spawned Vigilante 8 as well? Once again though, this is Activision we're talking about, so Lord knows if they have any desire to revisit this particular era of their existence. Sega had a number of unique and interesting games that they released on the Wii, but the one that personally interests me the most is MADWORLD, because it's one of those games that just kinda came and went, with the only significant aspect of its legacy being that it's the game for which the term spectacle fighter was coined.
There really needs to be a name for this subgenre, so I'm going to make one up. Spectacle fighters.
It's a game primarily built around killing people in the most spectacular ways possible in order to rack up enough points to move on to the next level. It has a very interesting cel-shaded black and white art style that uses blood red as the only color on display. It's a game with a lot of unique ideas and potential for being really fun and interesting, but the overall game I found to be kind of repetitive more than anything. It just doesn't nearly have enough variety to make the most out of its concept. And it doesn't really have anything to compensate for its shortcomings, making for a decent but unremarkable game, which is why I say it's something worth trying again. And the property is presumably still owned by Sega, so I could see this actually potentially happening. Sega is actually a pretty good developer with a halfway decent batting average for most of their IP outside of Sonic. I would like to see them give MADWORLD another shot. And since you'd be releasing it on consoles much more powerful than the Wii, you could probably do a lot more with it technology-wise. Give MADWORLD a mad remake. And hey, they could always give the sequel Anarchy Reigns a remake, you know, if they're feeling bold enough. Subversive is a relatively dirty word these days because a lot of people unjustly associate the term subversive with screw the audience, but I personally think that subversion is an important tool in media. Hence the game PO'd. It was a subversive first-person shooter from the mid-90s where you play as a cook in a deep space cruiser who's the last surviving human on board after the ship is attacked by aliens. So you have to sort things out with an assortment of weapons that range from frying pans to ray guns. Unfortunately, the humorous premise doesn't really carry into the gameplay where it becomes a straight-faced shooter minus some charming enemy design. Plus, the game suffers from being a console FPS pre-dual analog, and so the controls are just kinda terrible. Then there's the level design. This is supposed to be the inside of a spaceship, and yet you have weird areas like this. It just looks like a standard FPS level, and one that's far too open to have compelling design. Then there's the art design, which is strange, and ironically too alien for the premise. So I say take the premise and make a funny subversive first-person shooter with modern-day sensibilities and more logical level design. I'd play the hell out of that. I don't know who owns the rights to this game, but whoever does needs to get on that. I guess I wouldn't necessarily call Heavenly Sword overly weird or overly obscure, especially given the fact that this was a game heavily pushed by PlayStation back in the early days of the PlayStation 3, but this is a franchise that's long since been forgotten. It's a God of War style game with style switching mechanics and potentially an interesting lore. The original Heavenly Sword wasn't the greatest, you can hear my opinion of that in the failed franchise edition of the God of War knockoffs collection, but it had a lot of potential and the game itself was pretty decent. If they had a second chance, I believe that this could potentially be another feather in the cap of PlayStation's lineup of exclusive content. They wanted to make it a trilogy, but that never came to be. And I feel like this is a franchise that has all the potential in the world, especially if they stick to the God of War style gameplay, seeing as modern God of War is different to classic God of War. This might give the people who don't like modern God of War something to whet their gusset. So get on that, Sony. Viewtiful Joe went to the Devil May Cry school of stylishness, which makes sense because it was also directed by Hideki Kamehameha. It's a side-on 2D platform brawler that uses the ability to speed up and slow down time in order to rack up combos and fight the various enemies in various ways. It's a challenging and frighteningly flashy game that's fun as hell, with a charming art style, a sense of humor about itself, and a lot of untapped potential. Unfortunately, it didn't really seem to find its audience when it came out, and as such has wallowed in the garbage bin of history since 2005. But this is Capcom, who's made an effort to re-release and update their back catalog in the past few years. So I think this one has a distinct possibility of happening, especially seeing as it's not even the most obscure thing they've brought back. Hello Killer 7, although publishing duties were handed over to a different company in that case, but I have faith. I know this is old news, but RIP the Flash engine. It brought me many great memories during a period of time when I wasn't console gaming, but also didn't have a powerful enough PC to run a lot of games. But if there is some solace I have with the death of the Flash engine, it's that many of the best games were re-released on digital storefronts like Steam. Things like Motherlode or The Last Stand, but among Flash games, Thing was an exemplar, utilizing a fairly unique art style, stylish and varied action, as well as gratuitous violence to create a compelling series of Flash games. The series was pretty much over and done with before social media was even much of a thing, so it's hard to find anything about the creator, a man who went by Sean Weasel McGee, but apparently he abandoned game development despite clearly having talent. Though that could have just been a rumor, and I feel like in this age of old school Flash developers making it big as solo game developers, Thing as a series is a perfect candidate to be remade or reimagined. Because the series definitely had its issues, like how the overarching plot was an inconsistent mess because Weasel didn't quite know what he wanted the series to be until the third entry. So this is my plea, Weasel. If you're watching this, your series is worth another go. Okay, so this is a bit of a cheat, but I don't care. There was a company called Terminal Reality who's probably most well known for the memed to hell Star Wars Connect, and they made sort of a trilogy of combat flight sims that were really fun, but maybe didn't reach the notoriety that they deserved. It's only sort of a trilogy because despite basically being the same games, the first one they made, Terminal Velocity, was a standalone product, whereas Fury 3 and Hellbender are games in the same series. Why they would name a sequel to Fury 3 Hellbender, I have no idea. Seems like they just went out of their way to kill any recognizability in their IP. Though I'd imagine it was difficult trying to come up with a name for a sequel to a game that had a number in the title already, which was also the first in the series, although I've never been sure, but it actually might be called Fury Cubed. Either way, I'm most familiar with Fury 3, but these are basically all the same games. Combat flight sims where you travel from planet to planet blasting fools and accomplishing various tasks, explore, and fight bosses. It's a simple gameplay style done really well, but held back by the technology of the time given that the most recent game in the trilogy was made in the mid-90s. So I would like to see them give another shot to this underserved genre. Now, it should be mentioned that Terminal Velocity did get a remaster, but it wasn't the best. I'm not sure what the status on the rights for Fury 3 and Hellbender are, but I think to hell with remasters, these games deserve full remakes. When I was thinking up this list, I didn't intend for any one entry to be placed on a higher pedestal than the others, but when thinking of what to put as the number one entry on the list, I thought to myself, I might as well end strong. So what is the most obscure game that I've ever played and thought, there is something here? And really, there was only ever one answer, that being The Plan, or as it's written, TH3 Plan. It was an obscure PS2 game from 2006 that I picked up for $1 when my local stores were liquidating their stock of PS2 games. You're a team of master thieves pulling a series of heists on a former colleague who betrayed you, and the unique selling point of the gameplay is having to switch between 3 different characters, each with complementary skills in order to pull off the setup and execution of these heists. The problem is, it's not a very well fleshed out system of gameplay. There's only a handful of missions where the 3-character setup really comes into it, with only a handful of puzzles requiring characters to work in tandem, and towards the end of the game, the clever heist-centric gameplay gives way to mindless action as we shift into badly made third-person shooter territory. It's a great idea, it just wasn't executed particularly well, so I say give it another shot. Give us several more multi-part missions based around setting up a heist and then pulling it off. Really take advantage of the unique gameplay formula as much as you possibly can. And then you can even add some more missions later down the line as DLC. Also, you could have missions specifically built for online play. The Plan is a single-player game first and foremost, which means you can only control one of the 3 players at any given time, so doing something with one player and then switching to another player to do something else is as complex as the puzzling gets. But if you build some extra missions for multiplayer, you can have it to where you can coordinate specific puzzles around all 3 players acting at the exact same time as they're controlled by separate people. There's a lot of potential here, and I would love to see something like this be brought to fruition, and hey, I don't see why it couldn't happen. Eco Software, the developer, is still around, and they haven't exactly been lighting the world on fire. This is one of the few things they've made that isn't licensed, so I say give it another shot, guys. Maybe they could even get Quantic Dream back to do whatever the hell they helped out with in the original. Anyways, that's the list. Be sure to like this video, subscribe, hit the notification icon so you're always up to date on what I'm doing, and if you want to support me directly, you can donate to my Patreon for unique perks and rewards, including early access, exclusive content, and Discord benefits, along with these fine folks right here. And an extra special thank you to Brooklyn, D-Betch, Gaw004, Cotton Swab, Christopher Fulton, Layabout, My Name is Tank, FarmCat84, Raph, Ty Trovy, and Weird Webster for going above and beyond. Elsewise than that, I've been the King of Snark Style right here on Tactical Bacon Productions, and I will see you next time. Peace!